in New York, and I'll be facilitating today's webcast and discussion on the topic. I'd like to thank Megan Pistole-Shaw for technical assistance with today's broadcast. And due to the amount of participants on the call, I'd like to ask that all participants mute your audio so as not to distract from the presenters. Also, with the exception of presenters, we recommend turning off your cameras to allow for better bandwidth during the call. The program is intended to be no more than 1 hour in length. However, we did reserve the Zoom license for longer, but that's just to cover our prep time and overruns. During the program, we will be hearing from myself, providing an overview of the Nature Conservancy's Invasive Species Advisory Committee, Leigh Greenwood, Forest Health Program Director located in Missoula, Montana, and Nancy Olmstead, Conservation Ecologist with the Nature Conservancy in Maine. During the presentation, we intend to conduct polling and ask for your participation in these polls. Towards the end of the hour, we hope to have time for a brief discussion and would ask that you place any questions you may have into the chat box. Time permitting, I'll extract a few questions for the presenters. For those of you who may not be well acquainted with the Nature Conservancy's Invasive Species Advisory Committee, we were established in 2012 under a charter sponsored through our North American science team, and we represent a community of practice whose aim is to help prevent and address threats posed by invasive species. We focus primarily on where invasive species threaten our shared conservation agenda goals of ensuring healthy oceans, fresh water, and lands, and addressing biodiversity in a changing climate. Our current representation includes 15 representatives from 12 states from coast to coast across the U.S., including North America representatives sitting in 3 additional states shown in green here. Invasive Species Advisory Committee members are listed here, and you'll have an opportunity at the end of today's webcast to view our active members again before we depart. Some of the advisory committee's accomplishments include biological control guidance. We revised an outdated and unscientific operating procedure and downscaled it to a guidance rather than an SOP. We developed an executive summary on how the Nature Conservancy uses herbicides on managed lands to meet conservation objectives in cases where herbicides provide the most effective method and only when and where appropriate. In 2019, a team of stewardship, science, and conservation staff from across the United States prepared a guidance document for the Eastern U.S. under the sponsorship of Mark Anderson, which provides guidance for the Nature Conservancy's land management practitioners on how to incorporate principles for managing terrestrial systems for ecosystem resilience into stewardship and restoration activities. This Managing for Resilience document addresses managing for soil, freshwater, fire, connectivity, composition and structure, species and systems, and invasive plants, animals, pests, and pathogens. And more recently, we published a document on the correlation between insect and disease with reduced carbon sequestration in forests of the contiguous United States. Recently, we developed a 2-year work plan of which 81% directly supports TNC's shared conservation agenda and our 2030 goals. The work plan also recognizes 3 main focus categories to include organizational, communications, and strategic initiatives. Our communication strategy is based on feedback from a broad list of Nature Conservancy representatives, which includes an evaluation of subject matter along with frequency and informational needs. Part of our communication strategy is to provide informational webinars such as the one we're all on today. So I'd like to open today's talk by saying that the ways we talk about invasive species control management tools and the species themselves have been influenced by cultural and other biases for as long as invasive species have been understood as a concept. I'd like to introduce Leigh Greenwood and Nancy Olmstead to lead us in a discussion about the current thinking on reducing xenophobia, bias, militarism, racism, and exclusionary concepts from the outreach, education, and management messages surrounding invasive species. We will discuss ways to get involved with current efforts, as well as ways you can improve your own communication practices. We also acknowledge we do not have all the answers on this topic, but hope to convey a better understanding, which may lead to improved communications. So allow me to introduce both Leigh Greenwood, who is the Nature Conservancy's Forest Health Program Director for the North American region, and a longtime member of the Nature Conservancy's Invasive Species Advisory Council. While she lives in Missoula, Montana, her work on forest pests and continent-wide and even global policy and research impacts. And also, I'd like to introduce Nancy Olmstead, who works as a conservation ecologist for the Nature Conservancy in Maine, where she supports wetland restoration and protection, land management on TNC preserves, and ecological monitoring. In a previous role, Nancy served as the terrestrial invasive species plant biologist for the state of Maine. With these introductions, I will turn it over to Leigh and Nancy.
Thanks so much, Rob. I'm going to kick it off today. Welcome, everyone. And Rob, when you stop sharing, I can start sharing my presentation. Bear with me just a minute here, folks. All right, and great. So Rob, can you just confirm that the audience is seeing my first slide? It looks like they are. Great.
Yes, we are.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to kick us off talking a bit about language and messaging with regard to invasive species management, and Leigh is going to follow talking about naming specifically and some of the challenges and problems associated with naming in this environment. And as Rob said, I come from TNC Maine, and I'm new to this position and happy to be part of the TNC Invasive Species Advisory Committee. And at this time, I would like to ask Megan to please launch our first poll, because we'd like to know a bit more about you, the audience. We'd like to know, in which TNC region do you primarily work? So if you could please select from the choices presented here, we will get to know a little bit more about the audience. So we'll give that a few more seconds for people to make their submissions. I just submitted mine, and that way we can get a better sense of the types of invasive species challenges that you all are facing, because obviously this is a regional issue in some ways. So we'll just give that another couple seconds. And Megan, I'm going to rely on you as the wizard in the background to call it when you feel like we've seen most responses. Okay, thanks, Megan. Great. So it looks like we have a lot of folks from the Northeast today, and a smattering also of folks from other regions, including the Great Plains and Midwest and Southern. Okay, welcome to those joining from California and Hawaii, and thank you. I know it's early in some of those locations. Terrific. So thanks for all of that. Helps us to understand sort of who we're speaking to. So I need to activate my next slide. Let's see here. Click. Great. So in addition to being called the state of Maine, the lands that I am sitting in today are the homelands of the Wabanaki people. So these are the Micmac, Maliseet, Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, and formerly the Abenaki peoples that have resided in the lands that we currently call Maine. As you see in this photo, Maine is predominantly forested, and so I'm going to speak about that as sort of my ecology of place, because this is where I've practiced most of my professional life. 90% of Maine is forested, including a lot of forested wetlands. So on the left of this image, you are seeing a large white pine. This is a white pine mixed conifer forest in sort of north central Maine. And on the right-hand side, you're seeing a picture of my colleague, Josh Roit, standing in the dense shrub understory of a black spruce bog in down east Maine. So these are closed canopy forests dominated by trees and woody shrubs mostly, with definitely some areas of heavy herbaceous or low growing plant cover, but that's kind of the environment in which I work. And I want to also acknowledge that my lens and my practice has been with terrestrial invasive plants. So I am by no means an expert on aquatic invasive plants or insects or pathogens. So I just wanted to give you a bit of a sense of where I'm coming from. This is me standing in front of a large autumn olive shrub. I did a lot of mapping and managing of invasive plants in my previous role. About invasive terrestrial plants. And so I've wrestled with these concepts for about 8 or 9 years now. So I'd like to posit today or propose to you that invasive species language is problematic. And so some of the problematic terms include the word invasive, non-native, exotic, and alien, and problematic messaging such as a war on weeds, eradication campaign, attacking, fill in the blank with your species, and uninvited invaders. And I'd like to unpack a bit more as, in terms of why I think these are problematic and some examples and what we can do about it and how we can perhaps shift our language and messaging. So I think, and I've thought about this, and I think I've simplified or tried to simplify what is the problem into a couple of points. So I think that an emphasis on the geography of origin oversimplifies invasive species ecology in problematic ways, and messaging can reinforce that. So I'll give some examples of what I mean by oversimplifying invasive species ecology, and you'll see that I'm using an abbreviation here for invasive species, IS. So some of examples or ways that languaging and messaging can be problematic include warlike language and messaging that can imply malintent and feed into xenophobia and racism. Number two, a focus on non-native species can imply that all such species are harmful, which is not always true. Number three, we have to recognize that facilitating factors can be important. And number four, the language of aggressive invaders versus recognizing intentional introductions. So I'm going to speak about each of these a little bit more, and we will find a way to share these slides. So rest assured that you don't have to write every word down if you're a note taker. So here is a screenshot of the Brookings Institution website talking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And this language resurfaced this year with the war in Ukraine. And it is just a reminder, a current reminder of the origin of this language. And it has to do with war and aggression. And so, this association with military language carries an implication of agency and or malintent. And that can create a perceived or actual xenophobia, fear of foreigners, and racism. So an example of this that was brought home to me was a poll, the upshot of which was reported in August of this year widely. This was a poll by NPR and Ipsos. And this image is from the Ipsos.com website. And I'd like to call your attention to this red oval where they're asking the poll respondents, to what extent, if any, do you believe the following are true? And the question here is, the US is experiencing an invasion at the southern border. And what this bar is showing is that 54% of respondents believed that that was completely true or somewhat true. Again, 54% of respondents believed that it was completely or somewhat true that the US is experiencing an invasion at the southern border. And I find this language very problematic and racist. And so this was an example of a time that the language coincided with how we talk about invasive species in a way that's very problematic. Another issue is a focus on non-native or non-indigenous species can imply that all such species are harmful, which is false. So it used to be that invasion biologists talked about the TNC rule. The idea was that of 100 species that were introduced, only 10% could become naturalized or established outside of human cultivation or human habitats or help, without human help, and that only 10% of those became invasive. So the idea was that only like 1% of species became invasive. This was reviewed in this book from CABI, and I forget what CABI stands for, but it's an international organization, very reputable, that has published a book on invasion biology. This is a specifically invasive species related organization. And the authors reviewed different studies, and including a meta-analysis that showed no support for the TNC rule hypothesis. Instead, the authors found that about 25% of non-native plants and invertebrates and about 50% of non-native vertebrates can typically become invasive. So these numbers are higher than the TNC rule, but still, when you think about it, 25% is a low proportion in terms of non-native plants and invertebrates, and 50% is certainly higher for vertebrates, but still only about half of those non-native vertebrates become invasive. So obviously this is, we learn more about species every day, and species that are not invasive now could become invasive due to other factors, but it's important to keep in mind that many non-native species are not invasive. Sometimes when we talk about invasive species, we omit facilitating factors that are really important. So here in the Northeast, we have overabundant ungulates like white-tailed deer and moose. We also in this country have a history of suppression of fire. I don't know very much about those systems because they're not the systems in which I practice, but I know that for many of my colleagues in the West, this is very important. Similarly, habitat fragmentation and destruction can be really important when we talk about how invasive species become dominant. And other pests and even other invasive species can synergistically affect the dominance of invasive species. So earthworms are invasive in this part of the country, and there have been several studies that document increases in invasive plants in areas that have already experienced changes due to earthworms. So these are just some of the complicating factors or facilitating factors, and when we don't talk about this, it can reinforce sort of this concept of an aggressive invader that can sort of dominate and take over. And we lose some of the subtlety of what's happening in the whole ecosystem. Another issue is with agency. So there's a narrative of uninvited aggressive invaders that can hide the reality of intentional introductions for many taxa. So for invasive plants, they mostly were brought on purpose, often by people of privilege. And so this was a study by Leigh et al. From 2013 in the American Journal of Botany that found that 62% of invasive plant introductions were deliberate, and they were for a variety of reasons. Only about 9% were truly accidental, as defined by the authors, and many were unknown. It was unknown how they arrived. And I want to say that I know that these numbers vary by taxa. So I don't actually recall whether this study included, for example, aquatic invasive plants. And I know that the numbers will vary by taxa, by group of organisms. So it's not to say that mostly brought on purpose applies to every invasive species, but these are the sorts of numbers that we would want to have to hand when we start discussing these with the general public, so that we can recognize our agency in bringing some of these species here on purpose, or recognize that our global transportation networks, which we participate in, are vectors for these establishments. So this is not a new problem. I know that people have been talking about these issues with language for a long time. So this is a screenshot of the abstract of a paper from 2005. Can't believe it, but that's a long time ago now, from the journal Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment. Brendan Larson wrote this paper, The War of the Roses, Demilitarizing Invasion Biology, excuse me, saying that biologists need to continuously reflect upon the ethical and rhetorical dimensions of their language. They can lead to inaccurate perception of invasive species and contribute to social misunderstanding, charges of xenophobia, and loss of scientific credibility, etc. So it's not a new problem, but I think we've been struggling to find good solutions to the problem. And so with that in mind, I know that many of you have also been struggling with this and trying to find good solutions. So I'm going to offer some possible best practices for your review, for our review together. I'm very much interested in also hearing from you about how you are changing your language and messaging. But we wanted to have start this conversation within TNC. So number one, avoiding the use of warlike metaphors and language. So this seems pretty straightforward, trying to avoid militarizing our land management activities. Number two, investigate and name the agency of people of privilege in the arrival of invasive species. So trying to bring that into our practice as we do our education and outreach and as we talk about the issue of invasive species. I recognize again that varies by taxa. Number three, routinely place invasive species in the context of facilitating factors and other stressors. So recognizing that there are many stressors to our ecosystems and that there are facilitating factors can help to place invasive species in a proper context and make it a little bit less black and white. I think sometimes we just need to openly denounce xenophobia and racism. So within the past 5 or 6 years, there's been some really challenging news, and Maine is a state where we have a lot of new Mainers, predominantly people of color who have come to the United States as refugees or asylees or as economic migrants. And it has been something that I've had to do sometimes is just say, when I'm talking about invasive species, that I am not talking about people. I am talking about fungi and insects and plants. And I realized that kind of, it's a change in some ways from thinking about people as part of nature, because I'm calling out that I don't use this language of invasive species when I'm talking about people. And so I'm just going to name that feels a little uncomfortable in some levels, but I have used that as a way to reassure my audiences that I renounce the use of this language in a racist way. Number 5, emphasize the desired ecosystem state rather than the activity of invasive species removal. So trying to emphasize our goals of having a healthy ecosystem rather than simply a goal of removing or killing or eradicating an invasive species. So I'm going to give an example now of some messaging that I used in a presentation to a nonprofit group of individuals who were mounting a campaign to do some invasive plant work in their kind of geography of interest. So the next slides are going to simply be some of my slides from that presentation as an example of messaging that I've used. So here we go. So, I'm going to pause for a second and take a sip of my tea. So this language of, I'm just checking my time. Okay. This language of thriving native plant communities build healthy ecological relationships, trying to place people firmly in what we're looking to achieve, healthy ecological relationships based on thriving native plant communities. Food web relationships depend on native plants, talking about how many of our insects depend on certain plants with which they've co-evolved. Insects like the monarch butterfly, like this beautiful Luna moth, They only have the co-evolved enzymes to digest certain plants' tissues because plants are actively defending themselves, and they have chemistry that deters most herbivory, but that some insects have evolved to eat these plants, and that's a lot of the base of some of our terrestrial food webs. Insects transfer a lot of fat and protein up the food web, and they're really cool and beautiful, as you can see in this slide, and they depend on native plants. Land stewardship is about tending those relationships. We can all enjoy the amazing presence of trees, but those native plants may need tending sometimes. And so we can help native plants by removing invasive plants. This is one of my AmeriCorps volunteers from a couple of years ago. We were doing manual removal of some invasive honeysuckle shrubs that day. So that was just an example of some messaging. Thank you for your attention and participation today. And I look forward to hearing your best practices and questions during our Q&A time. So I'm going to stop sharing, turn it over to Leigh for a talk on naming.
Thanks, Nancy. Can you thumbs up? You can hear me okay, or somebody just call out? Sounds good. Thumbs up from Nancy. Excellent. I'm going to share. I'm going to go into presentation mode. I'm going to try. Okay, there we go. Now I'm in presentation mode. So hello, everyone. Thanks so much for taking your Friday morning to join us. Well, okay, it's Friday morning here in Montana, but I do realize that judging from that geography poll that we did earlier, a lot of you are actually already on Friday afternoon. So congratulations, you're almost there with your week. My name's Leigh Greenwood. I'm the Forest Health Program Director for the North America region of the Nature Conservancy. And I put this prompt on the slide that I wanted to remember to prompt Megan to please launch that second poll, which is going to talk about what taxa you know the best. So with which invasive species taxa and habitat do you have the most familiarity? It's multiple choice, so if you work across all of them or two of them, that's fine. I'm gonna put my own one in. I'm most familiar with terrestrial invertebrates and pathogens, so submit. There you go. In a few minutes, or not a few minutes, in less than a minute, I'm sure Megan will close up shop on that and we'll be able to see the results. On my slide, while you're hitting submit on your poll, you can see a beautiful spongy moth. It's actually quite an attractive little creature on a larch in this picture, and it's going to play a large role in my presentation. So I will be discussing the aspect of common names, which is also an aspect of invasive species that really pertains a lot to our perceptions and language use, and all the different things that Nancy just spoke about. So Megan, if you could show us the results, let's see what everybody works on real quick. Ooh, terrestrial plants. Oh my gosh, we got 83% plant lovers here, or plant workers here. Okay, so invertebrates, some aquatic plant folks, some folks that are not feeling a taxa. That's great. Okay, cool. Thanks everyone for doing that poll. It's helpful to set the stage for how we do Q&A, and also just so we can understand who's coming. All right. So these are spongy moths, again, on the tree. And I have been deeply involved for the last almost 3 years now in the efforts around the renaming of Lymantria dispar, which is now known as spongy moth. And the president of the Entomological Society of America at the time that we commenced the effort to rename this invasive forest pest gave this statement as part of the process, which is that the purpose of common names is to make communication easier between scientists and the public audiences they serve. Names that are unwelcoming to marginalized communities run directly counter to that goal. And the prior name, which I'll try to only say once, was gypsy moth. And gypsy is a very well understood ethnic slur for the Roma or Romani people that have faced hundreds of years of persecution in across Europe and the world. And so to have a species of invasive, to have an invasive species that bears that name furthered the persecution and moved it into a scientific realm. And that was the project. That was the concept behind the project to change the name, which is that as scientists, we can do a heck of a lot better than that. And so we should. At the same time, I would say not entirely by coincidence, but due to an increasing understanding of these concerns, U.S. Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, at about the same time launched the effort to remove some of the offensive terminology off of landforms as held by the U.S. Geological Survey naming authority. And Secretary Haaland said that words matter. Consideration of these replacements is a big step forward in our efforts to remove derogatory terms whose expiration dates are long overdue. And I include this not because it has anything directly to do with the common names of invasive species, but because as a society, we are evaluating language in lots of different realms and spaces. And in doing so, we are not alone. So when you consider the way that you frame a message, the way that Nancy just talked about, that consideration of better, more thoughtful framing that is more productive and more inclusive is aligned with the better names of landforms, which were recently actually finalized. You can look up all 600 landforms that were renamed on a really cool map if you use the internet to find it, as well as the common names that we'll be discussing here. So both common names and Latin names can be deeply problematic. And on this map, it shows the fingerprint of colonialism, which is to say, in this case, Latin names that have a European moniker, an eponym or honorific, which is to say basically somebody's last name. And the lighter colored spaces have more species with European honorifics in them, which is funny because if you take a look, Europe is darker, which means there's fewer names for European scientists, predominantly white men, in Europe than there are in the places where they colonized, explored, and set their scientific footprint. Now, I'm not going to be talking about Latin names because this is an entirely different aspect of naming, but I think it's really helpful to sort of consider this fingerprint and how it relates to the larger conversation of names in general. With common names, we have three basic types of names that can be considered problematic across different types of sort of social concepts. One is outright slurs, like the moth that we just discussed. That is clearly problematic. Another is an eponym or an honorific, which is, like I said, typically speaking, somebody's last name. And those, sometimes those people are objectively pretty terrible people who perpetuated historical outrages or massacres or racism or whatever. Other times they are simply conceptually more neutral human beings, but they are in their context of colonialism, and that itself is problematic. And then lastly, we have geographic names. And geographic names would be something like the Asian longhorn beetle, an insect that I work with all the time, that names the geography of Asia, which is its origin. Those names can be deeply problematic as well, and we'll get into that in a moment here. Before we dig deep into that, let me just make sure this chat isn't an alert that, okay, Karen is mentioning something separate. So I wanted to make sure it wasn't that like you couldn't hear me. Okay, here's some example guidelines for new common names, which I think is really good because I want to phrase a little bit of this in the positive. So here's some examples of names that here are some concepts of names that work really well. So a name that is simple with two parts. One indicates the family or group, the other one modifies it. I gave this presentation on Wednesday to a different group and it was all fisheries people, so I used a lot of fish. So that's like rainbow trout, great name. Okay, the distinctive physical features that differentiate the species, that's useful. All right, well, let's talk about the long-nosed gar. Super cool fish, really long nose, great name. Okay, other useful descriptive terms could be the habitat, the association, the life stage, seasonal, something like that. All right, well, let's look at a fish. That's the creek chub. It lives in small bodies of water and it's in the chub family. Piece of cake, right? Specific words like modifiers and a common name should be generally understandable by a broad public audience. I like the name of the prickly sculpin because it's a cool name. Not everybody knows what a sculpin is, I suppose, but it is a type of fish and prickly is so incredibly evocative of what that fish looks like. So these are good names. Let's talk about bad names. Bad is obviously a judgment, but let's go with it. So here are some of the don'ts used by the Entomological Society so that you can understand naming guidelines better. Common names that incite offense, fear, negative emotional reactions like epidemic or murder or invasive, not considered best practices. That would include the informal terminology of murder hornets and the older, less used terminology for orca of killer whales. Both of these names are inciting of fear and violence and negativity. Neither of them are particularly helpful names. Neither of them are the most prominent use either. Descriptors of cultures or populations or ethnicities or races or industries or occupations are generally not going to be a good idea. I give the example of the Oriental rat flea, which is actually a approved name by the Entomological Society of America. It's a historical name. And that name could be deeply problematic if you were to think about the ways that we might try to eliminate fleas from our environment. And then the use of geographic descriptors in a common name is generally discouraged at this time. And this is a sort of rising issue. So that would be the example, for instance, the Japanese beetle. That is an insect that is invasive all over the eastern United States, as well as some small spot infestations in the western US and Canada. And a lot of you are probably quite familiar with the fact that it really likes to, in particular, eat roses and damage people's lawns. It is the subject of an extensively racist and xenophobic language usage dating back almost 100 years across the United States. And really, if you want to dig into how the Japanese beetle has been used as almost a weapon to incite fear against the Japanese people and immigration and so forth, that is a topic for an entirely different webinar. But it's a great example of how the geography name, which is true to the point of origin of the Japanese beetle, nonetheless is deeply damaging and perhaps should be considered for replacement. Now, speaking of replacement, the Entomological Society of America created a new process in 2021 as a large part of all of these conversations for renaming. Now, renaming uses the same general do's and don'ts as the prior listing, but instead of just allowing a few scientists to name brand new things, which obviously a brand new thing is going to, a brand new thing being an insect under the purview of the Entomological Society of America's process that did not have a common name prior to this moment. So it doesn't have to be new to science, it just has to be new to the attention of the Entomological Society of America. So when you name something that's new, you follow those prior guidelines. When you rename something, you have to have a much more robust and community name-based process because you're taking a historical name, a norm that is embedded throughout society. That's the nature of these name lists. And you have to make sure that you're including all of the key groups and interests that are going to be interested in both why are you changing this name and what are the repercussions of it. Now, this process was created in 2021, including an online form for any ESA member or an interested party to submit a name for reevaluation. So at the end of this webinar, if you wanted to go talk about an insect name and put it on that form, you would be welcome to do so. The very first insect that ever went through the Better Common Names project process is Lymantria dispar. And in this case, in the Better Common Names process, there is a line that is basically a special considerations line. So it says, whatever the reason for the need to rename, you should consider in the formation of the new name. And in this case, that meant that names related in any way to the stereotypes or themes related to the Roma or Romani people are excluded, even if they were deemed biologically accurate, which is really important to note, because one of the interesting things about the spongy moth is its tendency to be perceived as moving throughout the landscape. So it travels around. It travels on firewood, which is how it caught the attention of my expertise as a forest health program director. And it travels also on its own. And people associate the Roma or Romani people with a traveling lifestyle. Now, what's interesting is, as was brought to our attention by our Roma scholars that were part of the Better Common Names project community, traveling was and is a function of persecution. So it is not that the Roma people really wish to travel and wish to continue to move across the world. It is that they are frequently persecuted and forced to travel. That is not a reason to name this moth, or sorry, that is a reason that is very compelling to not rename this moth the traveling moth, for instance, because you would be perpetuating a stereotype due to its prior offensive, inappropriate, problematic name. So let's dig really into the process, because people are like, well, how do you even change a name? So I thought I'd let you all know how we did it. In 2021, we convened a working group. We made sure that we were highly inclusive. So there were over 50 different members that were self-selected to join through a very brief process, including Canadian representation, because of course, American English and Canadian English are highly related to one another. Using the new Better Common Names project working process and structure, we worked hard on this. We did a ton of research. We called for candidate names, also known as de novo names, which is basically, you got a good idea? Let's hear it. We got over 160 non-offensive names and then a bunch of really rude names that we excluded. We also researched the native range names in local languages. For instance, like Lymantria dispar has a range all across Eurasia. So all the way from Japan and northeastern Russia, all the way to Finland and the UK, Wales, etc. So you're looking at a ton of native language names across history of a pretty obvious forest pest. And we got over 60 translated and transliterated names across that range that we considered through the process. Then we used the working group to vote and comment and winnow down to top selections, which brought us down to about 30 acceptable names according to all of the different metrics that I mentioned before in terms of like, how do you structure a good name? What should it describe, etc. Then we did a public poll that had over 1,000 people contribute to assess the popularities and pitfalls. We discovered some unexpected pitfalls of some of the names and tossed them out because we didn't realize they had negative associations. That brought us down to 7 names. With those last 7 names, we had a robust discussion across lots of different types of people, and we really just dug deep into what would be the best name for this species, what would suit it the most, what was the most accurate. And we ended up picking spongy moth for a variety of reasons. But one of the most compelling is that we went all over the world to look at 220 different either invented or historical names. And we found that the name they use in Canada and French actually was the best. And gosh, that was an amazing realization. It was not decided ahead of time, as some people have implied, which is kind of funny to me. It actually sort of came upon us, and we were really thrilled with that because that allowed us to have an incredibly smooth transition with the Entomological Society of Canada, as well as just really clean translation capabilities for this new name. I can't pronounce it in French because I don't speak French, but it's like spongeuse. Okay, so actually we didn't really just rename one moth, as it turns out. We renamed a lot of moths. So we renamed spongy moth, and I just summarized that timeline in case anybody wants to keep an eye on it. But then we had internationally held regulatory terminology that also needed to be renamed. And we knew that. And so we engaged with that at the same time and tried to move that forward in a timely fashion. And those conversations occurred throughout last year and early this year. The new name was selected and internally confirmed in September. It has not been internationally announced, but it's already being used on the international sphere. It was actually mentioned just a couple weeks ago at the North American Plant Protection Organization annual virtual meeting. And the new name, which used to be, using that offensive terminology, Asian gypsy moth complex, now is the flighted spongy moth complex. That change means that now the biological characteristic that makes it an international concern, that the female moths of this particular group are capable of long distance flight, is now in the name. They are flighted. Spongy moth is the unified biological characteristic, that spongy egg case that's sort of orange and fluffy looking, although it doesn't feel fluffy when you touch it. That's in the name too. So this is a highly appropriate, accurate, useful, translatable new name that suits the need. We also have 6 more moths that we had to rename that are all closely related. They're in the Lymantria genus. And that pre-work was throughout this calendar year. We convened a large working group that was separate from the initial working group because these were not the same interested parties. They were different people. These are moths that are not yet typically established within North American forests or landscapes. And so they had different people who were interested in their names and interested in the social circumstances around those terms. So it required an entirely different working group. Only a few people were overlapping. And that working group worked for about 5 months to come up with 6 new names for these 6 moths. And the proposal was submitted about 3 weeks ago. And by amazing timing, it was actually accepted as a proposal, now open for public comment, by the Entomological Society of America on Wednesday. So you are all free to go take a look at it and comment. Hopefully you'll like the new names. I think they're fantastic, but I'm a little biased because I helped build them. But they're very informative. So in this context of, well, why do you even need to change these names? You have to remember all the things that Nancy indicated in her presentation that we see very much so in forest pests, which is that the context of the conversation around invasive species amplifies the issues of language. And specific to common names, when you have names associated with groups of people, whether that's ethnic, geographic, whatever, that context can become xenophobic, racist, harmful, and violent. And all the geographic names can become problematic under these structures. When you state that, oh, some names are neutral, like what's the problem with calling it a Norwegian rat or something like that? Your underlying bias of whether or not you can judge a country to be white enough to be neutral becomes apparent, and a real gut check for what are we trying to accomplish here? We're trying to move towards better names that do not implicate people in an invasive or government control or eradication conversation. It's incredibly important. And when you look at the context around, for instance, spotted lanternfly and how we're killing it and we're smashing it and we're destroying it, we want it dead. That's the government saying that in your face. And now let's all take a moment to look at all of this outreach and consider, what if this had been named by its geographic origin instead of its obvious physical characteristics? What if this was the Chinese lanternfly that just so happened to reach extremely high population density at the exact same time as the coronavirus epidemic? That's a very disturbing multiverse that we just sort of created in our imaginations, that we were killing and stomping and destroying something Chinese at the same time. And you can see that this would have been disastrously damaging. It would add to Asian American hate crimes. It would be really disturbing. And that's why names that are descriptive are better, and they serve us better, and they're just gonna work better for everybody. This problem is such a big deal that even The Onion, which is a satire website for anybody not familiar with it, makes fun of it, which is basically, what's a spotted lanternfly? Oh yeah, they've got it pretty accurate. Nice little joke about terrifying that our vineyards would be threatened. They say, where do they come from? Well, if we tell you, do you promise not to be racist about it? There it is in pop culture just about a month ago. This is a problem that absolutely goes way beyond invasive species, biologists, managers, and professionals. It's in internet satire now. It's out in the wild. So it's in your power to frame these changes as an opportunity for everybody. We can do a lot better. We can be accurate and descriptive. We can use spotted or prickly. We can choose to find names that serve us. They serve us for outreach and education, like spongy moth. That egg case appears spongy. It's got kind of like a crinkly texture. It's interesting. It catches your attention. And we can choose to make science and conservation so much more inclusive in the space of language, both through names and through message framing. I have this, but I'm going to skip it because I ran a little longer than I intended. And I'm going to, if anybody wants to know who's in charge of this space, I have a list here. So thank you so much for this opportunity to give this presentation. I want to make sure I don't totally run over our 10 minutes for open Q&A.
Super. Thank you so much, Leigh and Nancy. I will say, after hearing this, you know, it's already changed the way I'm thinking about all this. And I think it's you know, it's interesting. We seem to have become so comfortable with our current way of talking about problematic species, you know, that we've become somewhat complacent in that. And in doing so, we have weakened the conversation. Alternatively, if we can change the way we talk about, you know, the topic, we can strengthen the conversation. So At this point, I'd like to ask anyone who has questions to put them in the chat box. I think it's a little bit easier that way so that we're not talking over top of each other or unmuting and clicking all these buttons. And then I would ask both Nancy and Leigh to just check that chat box, and whoever you feel might be more appropriate to respond to that particular question, please do.
Yeah, Leigh, we could try to tag team this one because it's about plants, but it's about naming. This first question. Yeah, go ahead.
Let me start with Karen Lombard's question, which is right above Kate Harrington's question or statement. Karen states there's an effort currently to investigate origin and best practices as well for leveraging our lands initiative. And there's a whole webinar from the Diversity Day presentations that covers this. And I will put that webinar's link in the chat because I think anyone interested in what Karen is mentioning would be well served to watch that webinar. So I'll put that in the chat, but you're right. So let's get to Kate Harrington's question, which is, right now we use Japanese knotweed and Eurasian water milfoil as terms. What common names should we be using for these species? And oh boy, that's a hard question. So Nancy, I might see what your take is.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kate. It's challenging to know sometimes what the best terms would be. So yeah, you know, we don't have a lot of native knotweeds. And so at times, I think we can simply omit that geographic modifier and say knotweed. But I know that that's not the case for other species like milfoil. So we have many native milfoils. And so this is a case where the community of practice that is really familiar with these species probably needs to come together and identify characteristics of the species that are helpful as a new proposed common name. And I am not an expert in aquatic organisms, so I would hesitate to advise regarding that particular one. But I know in my practice, I've stopped using the term Japanese and I've just used knotweed. And then when I'm speaking regarding giant knotweed, I say giant knotweed to differentiate, because at least in the Northeast here, there aren't native knotweeds with which it would be confused. So that's been my practice. Similarly, I've stopped calling Japanese stilt grass by that name. I simply say stilt grass. It's unlikely to be confused. Bittersweet is a slightly different case because we do have an American bittersweet, but again, I can simply drop Asian in most cases because people know that because of the context of my speech, I am talking about not the native bittersweet, but the invasive one. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. You know, common names are really tricky because you do have this question of, well, okay, like, well, what should we be saying if we don't have a new name coming to us? And what Nancy said is absolutely accurate. Sometimes you can omit the geographic name and it doesn't do any harm to the outreach. Sometimes you can just put the word invasive there, like somebody mentions in the chat, that you could just say invasive, you know, whatever. That's Megan said, yeah, you could just say invasive water milfoil, which is great. The other thing is you can continue to use these names that are not best practices and frame them in ways that minimize harm. So, you know, talking about, you know, killing, destroying, and conquering something with a geographic name is very different from talking about, we're doing some habitat restoration. Here's a list of the plants that we will be removing in order to achieve our conservation objective. Like that framework really takes the bite out of the problem today, because these things are not solved quickly. And that's one of the reasons I took you all through that sort of nitty-gritty timeline. Like, this is not a trivial problem. These are huge historical issues that are going to continue for a very long time. And actually, if it's all right, Rob, I do want to bring up that other slide because it's quite relevant. So if you could close yours, let me just bring it up. One moment. Yeah, this one. Sorry, I'm trying to find the right window. Okay. So when we talk about these names, not every common name in the United States has a clear line of authority. And so I've been trying to build a list because people ask me. And I mean, I'm not an authority in common names. I know a lot about forest insects. So I've been saying, okay, well, what do we know? And what we do know is that insects and related arthropods found in the United States are, their names are held with great authority by the Entomological Society of America. You got the same situation for birds. You got the same situation for fish. You have a closely allied, good, solid line of jurisdiction for herps, so amphibians and reptiles. Totally. These guys maintain name groups. These are private professional societies with a long history of name authority. For a few terrestrial invasive plants, there is actual good documentation on appropriate name use by the Weed Science Society of America, but not all terrestrial plants, and not even all terrestrial non-native plants, and not even all terrestrial invasive plants. So you just don't have the taxonomic authority for a lot of these. So change has to come from a groundswell. It cannot, or a top down, but it cannot come through association processes like it could for these top level groups that I mentioned here, which is an important kind of jurisdictional consideration. So let me stop share because it works better for chat. So there you go. So let's see. Megan states, you did a lot of research to learn the origin and history of the species names. I'm curious, what type of resources does one use to research this topic? I mean, not to be silly, but mostly Google Scholar. And other, you know, it's just an extensive amount of internet and collegial conversations and discussions. There's an amazing amount of scholarship going on in this space right now. A lot of people are really trying to learn more and do better. And Nancy and I are, you know, part of a huge community of people that are attempting to do that. We just happen to be two from the Nature Conservancy that felt like we could give this particular presentation.
I see Kate has posted another chat about how we try to use language to motivate people to take action. And I agree that trying to you know, promote a sense of urgency is important. And I like your point about telling stories about the impacts. And I know that, you know, trying to compile for yourself, you know, documented lists of known impacts, that can be something that our committee, the Invasive Species Advisory Committee, possibly could help with, centralizing some of those. I know that, you know, we have a broad universe of hundreds of species. So, you know, your go-to resources on that are good. Like here in Maine, the website of the group for which I used to work does have some documented impacts listed for some of the sort of top threatening invasive plants, terrestrial plants. And yeah, I've relied on that to sort of try to convince people of a need to do something. And I think one thing that I have encountered in my past position when talking, for example, with journalists is that there's a desire to sort of have a lot of hyperbole and like try to catch people's attention with big headlines and, oh, you know, watch out, the such and such. And again, I think trying to place things in context is important. And I have received pressure, you know, to kind of simplify the message. And I think, you know, to the extent that we can avoid that, I think it's beneficial.
Yeah, there's a big difference between, you know, context and motivation and sensationalizing. And I think that's a fine line for us all to walk. Sometimes you want to sensationalize, you want to use an old, you know, Western looking wanted poster. At other times you need to take a step back and say, actually, this isn't really professional. This isn't really what I should be doing. This could, you know, this could cause harm, or this could be counterproductive. And there's many examples that we're going to run out of time, so I can't give, of how these names can cause counterproductive effects, and the language can cause counterproductive effects that don't meet your conservation outcome. And one of the most important things is it doesn't even truly matter if you believe these names are problematic or not. Because if you actually want to achieve your conservation objective and the name is getting in your way, then perhaps you should address that. It's okay if you think that actually there's no harm in the name. Are you protecting nature in the way that we are supposed to do as a Nature Conservancy employee is actually the question that surmounts whether or not you think that name is okay.
So we are about out of time. And I just wanted to say that this has been a very informative webinar, at least for myself, certainly for others, so much that I'm actually going to recommend this same presentation. Nancy and Leigh, you're on the hook for a New York statewide webinar, perhaps after the first of the year. But I would like to thank all of our presenters today and look forward to future discussions on the topic of problematic species. Feel free to reach us on Connect, or better yet, feel free to further this discussion by reaching out to us on the Invasives listserv. I'd like to thank everyone for participating today, and also a shout out to all those who are helping to protect our lands and waters from problematic species and their impacts. Please be on the lookout for future information sharing webinars sponsored by the Nature Conservancy's Invasive Species Advisory Committee. We appreciate everyone's time and engagement today. Until next time, we'll end the call by saying, live well, be well, and do good work. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Rob and Megan.
And Megan.